In number 18, again, I build a bridge that gives me a negative 10. Two numbers that multiply to a negative 10 but add to a positive 3 are going to be a positive 5 and a negative 2. And for this one, again, I can't use my shortcut, so I'm going to split up the middle term. So I've got a 10d squared plus 5d minus 2d minus 1. And now I'm going to factor by grouping. I group the first two together, group the second two together. Out of the first two terms, I can factor out a 5d, which leaves me with a 2d plus 1. Out of the second two terms, I'm going to factor out a negative 1, which would leave me with a positive 2d and a plus 1. And now once again, I have the same thing in these parentheses, and that's kind of the goal of factoring by grouping. So my two factors are the 5d minus 1 and the 2d plus 1. And that's it. In number 19, once again, we build a bridge. So this time, but before I build a bridge on this one, if I look, I have a greatest common factor here. I have a greatest common factor of 5. So I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor first. So if I factor that out, that leaves me with a 6g squared minus gh minus a 3h squared. And that's important because this makes the trinomial inside much simpler because I'm dealing with smaller numbers. Now when I build a bridge, it gives me a negative 18. Two numbers that multiply to a negative 18 but add together to give me a negative 1. And as I look at this one, I can't think of any two factors that are going to allow that to happen. I've got 18 and 1, 9 and 2, 6 and 3, and that's about it for 18. So this one's not going to factor any further. So that means this is my answer, just the 5 on the outside with the 6g squared minus gh minus 3h squared. Okay, so keep that in mind. Sometimes all we can do is factor out the greatest common factor, and that's it. In number 20, I build a bridge that gives me a 64. The two numbers that multiply to 64 but add to a negative 16 are a negative 8 and a negative 8. So that means with this one, I can use my shortcut. That's going to factor into an x minus 8 and an x minus 8. But don't leave it like this. Remember, this was a perfect square trinomial. So this one factors into an x minus 8 squared. And that's the way we want to rewrite this since it's the same binomial times itself. In number 21, it says, suppose that the area of a square lawn is 16x squared plus 8x plus 1. What is the length of one side of the lawn? And since it's talking about a square, if the length and width, that means the length and width are going to be the same, which means they're implying here that this is going to be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, and again, I build a bridge. That gives me a 16. Two numbers that multiply to a 16 but add to an 8 are a 4 and a 4. And from here, if we recognize that this is a perfect square trinomial, because we got the same two values there, we could go right to the final answer. We know it's going to be a 4x plus 1 squared. Okay, if we don't recognize that, well, let's do it the way we normally do it. Let's split up the middle term. I'll do a 16x squared plus 4x plus 1. And now I do my factoring by grouping. I group the first two together, I group the second two together. Out of the first two, I factor out a 4x, which leaves me with a 4x plus 1. Out of the second two, I have to factor something out, so I factor out a 1. That leaves me with a 4x plus 1. And now I have the same thing in parentheses. My two factors are the 4x plus 1, the things I factored out, and the 4x plus 1, the things I was left with in parentheses, which of course I would rewrite as a 4x plus 1 squared. Okay, so when we factor this, it says, what is the length of the lawn? So I guess technically, if we're talking about just the length of the lawn, the length would be a 4x plus 1. The width would also be a 4x plus 1. So in terms of our final answer, this is what they're actually asking for. Okay. The next one asks us to factor this completely. Again, if you don't recognize this is a difference of squares, so I know it's going to factor into conjugates, so it's going to be an x minus 7 and an an s minus 7 and an s plus 7. Because I recognize they're different squares, they have to factor into conjugates. If you don't recognize that, just remember that what you're missing here is the middle term. So you have a 0s that's missing. Well, now you can do it the way we've always done it. You can build a bridge. That's a negative 49. Two numbers that multiply to a negative 49 but add to a 0 are going to be a 7 and a negative 7. And this one, it's got a 1 out front. I can use my shortcut. So it's an S plus 7 and S minus 7. Okay? In number 23, it really pays to recognize that this is a difference of squares because for this one, if I put a 0 in the center, I'm going to end up having to split up the middle term factor by grouping. Can't use my shortcut with the 144. So recognizing that this is a difference of squares tells me that this is going to factor into conjugates. One's a plus and one's a minus. And now I just need to ask myself, what multiplied by itself will give me the 144b squared? And that's going to be a 12b. 12 times 12 gives me the 144, b times b gives me the b squared. And then I ask the same question about the 81. What times itself will give me that 81? And that's going to be a 9 times a 9. Again, these factors are exactly the same except the sign. One's a plus, one's a minus. For the next one, I've already got 4 terms. And remember, the whole reason that we build a bridge with a trinomial is so that we can turn it from having 3 terms to having 4 terms so we can do factoring by grouping. This one already has 4 terms, so I go right to factoring by grouping. I go right to that method because that's the end result of building a bridge anyway. So here, out of the first 2 terms, I can factor a 3x squared out, which is going to leave me with a 2x plus 1. Out of the second 2 terms, I have to factor something out, so I factor out a 1. That leaves me with a 2x plus 1. And now, once again, I have the same thing in parentheses. That's kind of the point. That's kind of the goal of factoring by grouping. So my 2 factors are the 3x squared plus 1 and the 2x plus 1. And that's it. The next one, again, we've already got 4 terms here. So I go right to factoring by grouping. I group the first 2 together, group the second 2 together. Out of the first 2 terms, I can factor out a 9k squared, which is going to leave me with an 8k minus 7. Out of the second 2 terms, I can factor out a 5, which is going to leave me with an 8k minus 7. Once again, I've got the same thing in each of these parentheses. So now my 2 factors are the 9k squared plus 5 and the 8k minus 7. And as you're working through these, it doesn't matter what order you write the 2 binomials in, so keep that in mind as well. Number 26, it says a box has a volume given by the trinomial x cubed plus 6x squared minus 16x. And we want to know what the possible dimensions are of this box, and we want to use factoring. And really, what we're going to do here is we're just going to factor this thing completely. Since it's telling me volume, it means I have to have 3 things being multiplied. So when I look at this, the first thing I notice is all 3 of these have an x in common. So I'm going to factor the x out, which is going to leave me with an x squared plus 6x minus 16. And now I take that trinomial that's left in my parentheses, I build a bridge, that's a negative 16. 2 numbers that multiply to a negative 16 but add to a positive 6 are a positive 8 and a negative 2. And so now with that, I can use my shortcut because there's a 1 out front, so it factors into an x plus 8 and an x minus 2. And now this x just tags along for the ride. And so these are my 3 possible dimensions, x, the x plus 8, and the x minus 2. And this one, it says factor the following expression. We want to factor this completely. So the first thing I want to do is I want to factor out the greatest common factor. If I look, all of these have a 14 in common. So if I factor out a 14, they all also have an x in common, and they all also have a y squared in common. So always look for that greatest common factor first, because it might make things much easier for you. For this one, the 168 divided by the 14, let's see, that's going to be a 12. So that leaves me with a 12x because the, a 12x squared, because the x cubed and the x cancel out to an x squared. The y squareds cancel out. Minus, that's going to be a 5x. And then the last piece, this is just going to be minus a 1, because that's my entire factor that just got taken out. And now from here, I look at the trinomial that's inside here. I build a bridge. That gives me a negative 12. 2 numbers that multiply together to give me a negative 12, but add together to give me a -5. It doesn't look like there is going to be one here. So since I can't factor that any further, I'm just going to leave it the way it is as the 14xy squared times the 12x squared minus 5x minus 1. Okay? And then the last one here, it says describe and correct the error made in factoring the trinomial. So for this one, we're going to describe the error right here. If we go ahead and work through this problem, if I build a bridge and get a -50, two numbers that multiply to a -50 but add to a -5 are a -10 and a +5. So right away I see that they mixed up their two signs. So their mistake is a sign error. And the correct factors should be the x minus 10 and the x plus 5. And that's it. Hope this was helpful, and good luck on your test.